I'm Chris Ferguson. I work with the World Council of Churches at the United Nations Liaison Office in New York. The UN office of the World Council of Churches, from the very beginning of the UN, was involved, in fact, in the elaboration of the Universal Declaration for Human Rights. And for instance, Article 18, the article on freedom of religion or belief, was crafted by members of the World Council of Churches and by the church groups. And so we continue that tradition even now. A current example has been the work that the WCC here in the New York office at the UN have done with other ecumenical groups in response to the churches and community organizations in the Philippines, where we have looked at the human rights mechanisms of the new Human Rights Council, particularly the Universal Periodic Review, which is a very specific mechanism, new, and asked how we could use this new mechanism to deal with the very serious problem of extrajudicial assassinations and intimidations that have plagued the people of the Philippines and that have claimed the lives of many church leaders, including a bishop in the Philippines. Jesus articulates this in saying that I've come so that all may have life and have life in abundance. So we see in this vision of the Creator God that the very gift of life itself is in peril all the time, and that the response to the gospel isn't simply the fact of creation, but saying we know this gift is in peril. That Jesus talks about having life abundant because that's not the situation that most people enjoy. And so that fundamental to the gospel is this question of creating the conditions so that all people can live the life that God wants them to. And understanding, of course, that all people are made in God's image, and so that there's no human being that's exempt from that promise of full life. That's the two fundamentals: the creation of human beings in God's image, and the fact that we're called to defend and protect fullness of life for everybody. One of the powerful stories in my own life was when we, in Canada, several of us received a call to say that there was a small and growing group of the families of people who were disappeared. And I'm speaking now of the practice of forcible disappearances, where the security forces, in this case Guatemala, rather than assassinate people, kill them or remove them or openly keep them and torture them, they made them disappear. There was a group that very simply started called the Group of Mutual Support, where women started meeting with each other to support each other as they went around to the morgues and hospitals and police stations and asked people they knew where their family members were. And they were attempting at great personal risk to get together and hold a demonstration, and there was a great deal of fear, and the word had come that if they gathered to have this march, that the army would intervene brutally and people would be killed. So the word got out that this was going to be even more dangerous than people had thought, and we weren't certain if anybody would come at all. And we sat in a room and evaluated the situation, and it reminded me of that story that's told in the gospel that after the resurrection, after the crucifixion, the disciples met in a room afraid, and it was like this in this room, just permeated by fear and death. And this woman who led the group said to us, we really admire your courage. And really, weeping, one of the pastors that were with us in the delegation said, you admire our courage compared to yours is like the lightning bug, you know, this little bug compared to the lightning. Because we saw in these women this unshakable courage. So we gathered in a square in Guatemala City. Everything was quiet. There were police around, but not many. I was afraid, and almost nobody there that morning, Saturday morning. 2 or 3 of the women had their banner. A few of us came, and we just felt as awful as we could feel because the place was empty, and apparently the intimidation had worked, and that maybe we were also, by being such a small group, particularly vulnerable. And then, after some minutes, 10, 15 minutes, when the appointed hour had passed, then minute by minute, people came and came and came, and there were more people and more people and more people, and the delegation began to walk in front of the police station and turned and threw on the steps also of the legislature. People had brought carnations, this flower, and threw these, crying out the name of the disappeared people who they were caring for and whose release they were demanding. And the steps were just filled with flowers, and people walking by one by one by one, calling out and defying, in fact, this tactic of intimidation. And I was just filled with this incredible hope that motivates this struggle for human rights. So in a situation that couldn't be worse, those people that were willing to stand up and defend the rights of those who had been disappeared and taken away, and the family members themselves being the ones that led that. And I felt how proud and possible it was that the church could be with those people that didn't flee after the crucifixion, the brave ones, the women that went back to the tomb, that demanded the dignity for those who had been crushed by the empire, and seen in that just this gospel moment of the courage of one leading to the courage of the other. There, so a story for me was it had all the right parts, that the power of life and the power of Jesus proclaiming love rights for all, Jesus saying abundant life, and on the other hand the human rights provisions, because they kind of held both in their hands, saying this is our rights according to law, and on the other hand this is our vision according to our faith, and then the church saying yes, and we will walk with those people who are prepared to say no to death and yes to life. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights is a secular legal expression, if you like, a semblance of the deeper conditions of peace and justice that God wills for the world. So we don't believe that the Human Rights Declaration is sacred, but it represents the same sacred goals that God has for the world. It's an approximation or a near expression of the importance. So we use it. So for the church, I would say that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is like a tool for the struggle for human dignity. It's something that we can use in our prophetic ministry to hold governments account. And we're, of course, in the terrible situation now that the very countries that promoted, countries of the West particularly, that promoted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights are now those who are eroding the rule of law, so that it can be a debate in the United States 60 years after the Universal Declaration was accepted worldwide, that whether or not these cruel and inhuman practices that we see the United States government allowing in interrogation, which we know to be torture, now it's an open question, is torture ethical and permitted and allowed? So we see the odd situation that the world on the one hand has never been clearer about the standards they should uphold, and at the same time have never been more flagrant in denying the standards. So before there was a debate, you could say that's our work to do, to get people to agree. Now they've agreed, and still human rights are flung aside in the false name of security and so on. Churches have to be involved in human rights because at its center, the question human rights is the expression of the of humanity, and human beings are created in God's image, and we have a world where human life is in danger, and the churches have to respond to that world that we have where human life is threatened. And so to love God is to care for God's creation, and human beings are at the center of that creation.